This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on Mission Life, an India-led global mass movement to protect and preserve environment. The participants are Ashish Chaturvedi, Head of Environment, Energy and Resilience at UNDP India, and Omvesh Upadhyay, AIR correspondent.
In the view of the danger lurking around the nature, ecosystem and environment, Prime Minister Narendra Modi on 20 October 2022 unveiled the action plan for Mission Life, Lifestyle for Environment, an India-led global mass movement that will nudge individuals and communities for action to protect and preserve the environment. Ashish ji, in the very beginning, I would like to know what exactly is the Mission Life and how great a significance does this hold, keeping in mind the state of rapid climate change.
So Mission Life was essentially launched by the Prime Minister as early as COP26, which happened in Glasgow. However, the antecedents and the need for Mission Life was actually enshrined in the Paris Agreement at the insistence of India in the sort of preamble of the Paris Agreement, which actually mentioned the propagation of sustainable lifestyles as a key element of keeping global warming to a manageable level within 1.5 degrees preferably, but definitely below 2 degrees. So Mission Life basically began as early as preamble of the Paris Agreement. As you mentioned in your remarks already, the Prime Minister launched it officially on 20th of October with the UN Secretary General, who was in Gujarat at the Statue of Unity at Kevadia, and I had the pleasure of being there in person as well. And I think this is where the global call for Mission Life was launched. And before that, in June this year on World Environment Day, the Prime Minister had actually launched a global call for ideas on Mission Life, which is going to conclude on 31st of December this year. So there is an entire program of activities which has led to the definition of this program called Mission Life. What it essentially contains is this idea of getting as much citizen participation as possible, because the Prime Minister has called for how individuals can actually drive climate action as well. It cannot be too distant from our individual choices. All our individual choices, from the kinds of things we eat, the way we move, the kind of clothes we wear, every individual consumption decision has an impact on the environment and also on the climate. And therefore, individual participation and the choices that individuals make will have a significant impact on how the climate is affected. And this is essentially what is the crux behind the Mission Life. According to the Niti Aayog, there are 75 actions which have been identified, which can be taken by individuals to improve their adherence to the principles of Mission Life.
Indeed, and you talked about how ideas were invited by government regarding the Mission Lifestyle. When we talk about that Mission Life is set to follow the participative approach, could you please elaborate more about it? How does it include the citizens in front in the playing role?
So India's had a tradition of living in harmony with nature. If you even look around you, and especially if you talk to the generation of your mother, sort of my mother or my grandmother, sort of they were living fairly well within the means, either because of choice, but also because of constraints which were imposed by availability of certain resources. So we've had a certain kind of tradition. Even the most affluent did not necessarily live at the expense of nature traditionally. However, over the last few sort of decades, we've seen that there is a certain class of people within this country, but also globally, who are definitely living much beyond the means of our natural carrying capacity of this planet, right? So by carrying capacity, I mean what the kind of resources which are available. And recent figures suggest that we need 2 Earths to maintain the standard and the kind of quality of living that we have kind of gotten used to. So this is clearly not sustainable. And if this is not sustainable, then who are the sort of key actors who can drive this sustainable behavior? Of course, large corporations do have a significant role to play in terms of what kind of products they make. But similarly, individuals, consumers who are actually making that buying decision also have agency. So in order to give individuals the agency, the participatory power it is good to kind of give a call for participation by all the consumers, individual consumers. And this is precisely what the Mission Life does. It gives a clarion call to individuals from around the world to make strong, positive consumption choices and to also get them to sort of acknowledge that their consumption decisions are actually going to have a significant impact on the sustainability of our planet.
Indeed, and I would like to state a fact here that India, if I'm not wrong, constitute around 17% of the world's population, but India's contribution to global carbon emissions is only 4%. Despite not being part of the problem in that big ways, our numerous global initiatives such as the International Solar Alliance, the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative, and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, India has taken the lead in presenting and building solutions for the world by bringing the global community together. So can we call our country a trendsetter who is continuously working towards the betterment of the environment, Ashish ji?
See, we can claim credit for a lot of things, but I think we have challenges as well, and I think both have to be acknowledged. So the list of things that you mentioned with the International Solar Alliance, CDRI, the OSO award, this One Sun, One World, One Grid, all of these are great initiatives and they need to be promoted and they need to be upscaled and they need to be brought to the global map. And I think India is already doing that under the G20 presidency. Of course, India is also going to push a lot of these agendas with its own priorities. But I think we also need to do more domestically. And although we are already on a good way in the recent ratings, the Climate Action Tracker ratings also mention India in the top 3 or 5. I don't remember exactly the number. But India is doing fairly well. We can do more. And of course, we don't have to do more just to please the rest of the world. I think it is in our own interest to scale up some of these initiatives. And I think LiFE is a great example. We have substantive portions of our own populations which are living quite unsustainably. And of course, that number in percentage terms might be small, but in absolute numbers, because of the size of our population, those numbers can actually get quite inflated as well. So I think we have to keep that at the back of our minds, that there is enough and more of a constituency within our own country, which should also be kind of pushing this agenda of sustainable lifestyles. And if you look around you, you know who these people are. In large cities, in sort of smaller towns, you can see really sort of wasteful consumption of different kinds. And also the new generation seems to be also adopting some of these behaviors, which I think can be moderated through the adoption of Mission Life. But having said that, I think I'm completely in alignment with the suggestion that, Mission Life is one of these global initiatives. So I think we should think of it as a global initiative. It's not necessarily an India initiative. It's an initiative which is originated in our country, but it's a global initiative because the challenges that have been created in other parts of the world are actually a much bigger contributor to the global climate change. And in fact, Mission Life should really be pushed in those other parts of the world as well, not only in our pockets and niches within India, but also in significant numbers of people, for the lack of a better phrase, developed countries who have appropriated a significant portion of the global carbon space, but they can also now be, exhorted to adopt more sustainable lifestyles.
Indeed, and very rightly you said that although it was originated in India, but it is our global movement. You mentioned briefly about India's G20 presidency and how India will likely give a thrust to lifestyle for environment thing. Could you please elaborate a bit on that as well?
Yeah, so I think as far as I know and to the best of our knowledge, lifestyles for environment is going to be a critical cross-cutting priority of the Indian G20 presidency. And I think it fits into several different agendas. Of course, it's about environment, climate, sustainability as a priority area, but it's also about agriculture because the kind of food we eat, the kind of energy choices, so it's definitely a part of the energy transition working group, that part of the G20. It's definitely a developmental priority because Mission Life would cut across different kinds of economic sectors, but also about social indicators, about the environmental indicators as well. So I think it's going to feature quite broadly in the agenda of India's G20 presidency. And I think it remains to be seen how it is received by different parts of the G20, different countries which are a part of the G20. But I believe that it has great potential for arriving at some kind of collective positioning on how we work with our populations who seem to believe that governments are not doing enough on climate change. So I think it's basically about getting citizen participation. It's also making citizens a critical actor on climate action and not only about sort of recipients. And I think it also has this transversal option, like impact of creating citizenry which is demanding more change as well. So if citizens say that we are doing so much, adopting these lifestyles for environment, our government should also do much more as far as environment is concerned. So there's this feedback process which can be triggered by the adoption of this or spreading of this movement. And I think for all of these reasons, the push by the Indian presidency on LiFE can have significant impacts across the G20 countries to begin with. But of course, because the G20 countries have like 80% of global population, around 80-85% of the global GDP, of course, if it's adopted in the G20, and if it's supported by the G20, then it can be pushed in the rest of the world as well.
Ashish ji, you were very rightly saying about things that how India will take the Mission LiFE forward globally in the G20 presidency. I would also like to talk about one thing that when PM launched the Mission Lifestyle in October this year, he also talked about that how migration to cities is a recurring issue and we have to keep that point in mind as well. Under the action plan of Mission LiFE, one objective is to practice local and traditional so that our lifestyle doesn't affect the environment at current or greater level. What do you say about this? Because you in the very beginning talked about that we are the generation who had this upbringing and practices of going local, taking the traditional way of things. And it was in our lifestyle that we always preferred sustainable ways. Could you say something about that?
Well, I can give you this example of how the clothes from one siblings would go from one elder sibling to a younger sibling.
Indeed.
And this is pretty standard practice. And then, of course, when the clothes got older and they were about to be discarded, you would actually donate them and barter them for other things. I remember that in where I used to stay, my mother would exchange them for utensils. Where somebody would come to your place, they would take all the old clothes and then give you some small utensil, which was like a reward for doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is traditionally part of what we've been doing. But of course, I'm saying that I also acknowledge that not everybody currently, and especially those who are much more affluent, do not necessarily follow these choices because it's also aspirational to not be sustainable in certain pockets of our societies. And it's also because these choices, the kind of style of living that some countries in the West have adopted or more developed countries have adopted also seems sort of more aspirational, like changing a television even when if it is working, or changing a car just because society demands it or your social status demands it. So I think those are kinds of pressures that are created by different kinds of living styles, lifestyles. And the Prime Minister's call for kind of adhering to certain sustainable, mindful utilization of resources also allows us to kind of rethink some of these choices that we are making. And I think not everything that you do will come into conflict with the economy. So a lot of people might believe that if you become more sustainable, you necessarily reduce consumption. I don't think sustainable consumption is necessarily always about reduced consumption. Maybe in some parts of the world, it is about reduced consumption. Maybe in other parts of the world, it's about more sensible consumption. And maybe in the poorest parts of the world, it is about more consumption because they're consuming unsustainably low. But it's also always about thinking about what is the right type of consumption. Yes.
I really agree with your point, and I think the listeners will also enjoy when we share that what generational things that we learn by sharing. It is very important, whether it be clothes in between siblings or not wasting food, the little changes that you were talking about. Thank you so much, Ashish ji, for joining us today and having this meaningful and deep conversation with All India Radio. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
You were listening to a discussion on Mission LiFE, an India-led global mass movement to protect and preserve environment. The participants were Ashish Chaturvedi, Head of the Environment, Energy and Resilience at UNDP India, and Omvesh Upadhyay, AIR Correspondent. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.